Welcome to the Authentic Change Podcast. I'm Mike Horn, your host, and this podcast is for leaders and coaches who need and want fresh perspectives on what it means to live and to lead authentically. You're a leader who wants to make a difference, but sometimes you feel stuck. You know there's more to life and to leadership than what you're currently experiencing. It can be tough to figure out how to grow as a leader. You might be reading all the blogs and books, but it still feels like you're not making progress. You might even be feeling like you're doing everything wrong. On Authentic Change with Mike Horn, we interview experts who share their insights on how to live and lead authentically. Our guests are trendsetters in building great leaders, teams, and organizations. We provide fresh perspectives on what it means to live with purpose and authenticity. Welcome to this episode of the Authentic Change Podcast. Welcome to this episode of the Authentic Change Podcast. I am absolutely delighted to have in our virtual studio today, Laura Gramling, who is the president of Enspark Consulting. And Laura is an amazing individual, an amazing leader, who brings experience that she's gained from around the world to provide consulting services that are focused on accelerating change. And Laura, before I just go on more about you, I'm wondering if you could introduce yourself to our audience and say a few words and what it's like to be president of Enspark Consulting.
Oh, thank you so much, Mike. Happy to do that. Laura Gramling, president of Enspark Consulting. Our firm really focuses on working with leaders who are grappling with large-scale change, strategy, and their own personal growth and development. So that's the core of our focus, and it can look like a lot of different things depending on what the conversation is about that we're working with them. I've been in the field of organizational change for over 20 years. And in 2020, I wrote a book on how to have effective and great virtual meetings. But we're finding now people want to meet in person.
Isn't that interesting? A lot has certainly shifted in the last several years, the last few years.
Yeah.
But that's not unfamiliar territory to Laura Gramling, is the desire to meet in person. Because I imagine that more of your career has been spent helping people meet in physical locations as opposed to virtually, though I'm not saying the weight or the balance is more or less, but I imagine that most of the work was done with in-person groups.
Yeah, it's true. It's true. But I have to say, coming out of this, what I'm going to call almost post-pandemic, right? We have lingering effects of it still. People are, when they meet in person, it's different now, right? It's not just a meeting to meet. First of all, companies are not just flying their leaders around to do that anymore. There has to be a compelling reason. Location matters, being in situ someplace. But really the focus of the meeting, we're finding that, clearly people figured out how to do the Zoom and can do a lot of work, task-oriented, even collaboration online. But when it comes to that sort of deep thinking and thinking about strategy, it's best done in person. There's just no substitute for that. And especially now, now is actually the right time to meet. Many organizations have not done these large gatherings in a while. And so what I'm finding, like over and over again, there's three things that people want to do. My leaders are asking for. They want to reconnect. They want to reestablish those connections, that trust, that rapport, because that's how business gets done. Two, they got to reassess their strategy. What did they learn over the pandemic? What has shifted? Either fundamentally about their business or about how they work. So they have to kind of look back at their strategy. They may not throw it out, but they need to pivot it. And then they have to develop that and align on the compelling future. Where are we going next? What's the next thing that we're going to do? And that all takes some time, and that takes some space. And having Zoom meetings with It's just you can't do that. So a few people have asked me, well, can we do it in hybrid format? Not that meeting, not that strategy meeting, not that, real shift. Happy to do your task work hybrid online, no problem. But the important ones, people are making time to come together.
And I think you're immediately subject to criticism at some level, despite your best work or your best intentions, when there is an on-site meeting and there is one person on site.
Yeah.
For the best reasons possible, and the dynamic is altered or changed in some way.
Yeah.
And yet, I suspect that's such an important leadership lesson, isn't it? That people do have to be able to participate from where they sit. And
that's true. I mean, I just literally did a vision workshop in July with the group, national nonprofit organization, and their board, which came from many different organizations, said, yes, we need to meet. We need to have this vision workshop, marked off their calendars. It's going to be smallish, maybe 20, 25 people. And about a week out, we had about 5 or 6 people had to drop for various reasons. Some of them had COVID, family members with COVID, or their organizations just yanked back travel. We're seeing this travel, yes, no, right? So they pushed me hard. They're like, well, why don't we have a hybrid meeting? I'm like, nope, we're not doing a 6-hour hybrid meeting. But what I did design for them was we had the workshop. It was great. And then we synthesized all that data and we brought those 6 people on for an online meeting, very truncated, 90 minutes. You saw everything we were going to talk about. You had all the pre-reads. Here's what came out of it. What do you think? So they actually got to do that sort of second layer learning, building from their colleagues.
And it was sort of an observational method as well, I suppose. That's interesting. Wonder how you cover the areas of enfranchisement, though, and since you really work out of 2 spaces. I mean, let's talk about the leadership development and change management spaces. In that very interesting and creative use of work that you did, what leadership is required for that?
Yeah,
because I've had a meeting recently where I don't even think a leader showed up in the room.
Right. Well, this ability, or I'm not even calling it ability, it's a willingness, right? Leaders need to be willing to put aside what it should look like in order to focus on what matters. What's the essence? What's the essential pieces that are going to support our success collective, that enterprise-wide view, right? So that willingness to put aside, it has to look one way, it has to be done a certain way in order to contribute, right? Because even back in the day, we couldn't have everybody always available at a meeting. Crises happened. We're just more used to it now, right? So how can you contribute from wherever you are? And I think the understanding the role of a leader is to be able to contribute and align on a vision. You know this as well as anybody, having worked in large organizations. Alignment is so key, right? Top level, next layer out, right? And cascading throughout the organization. So, and then what are the structures? What does the leader need to do in order to allow that vision to succeed and become reality, right? And I think part of that, I've thought a lot about this recently, is how do people pivot and course correct quickly, right? When things don't go the way they think they should, or there's been another setback, some might call it reframing, right? How do I take this opportunity that, didn't go well? What do I learn from it? How do we move forward, right? So pivoting, reframing is essential key for leaders, and especially now.
It seems that you're describing inclusion and inclusionary behaviors and inclusive behaviors. And I think about that in relationship to strategy, which I think appeals to our rational, analytical side. And yet, without the emotional intelligence that's required to create an inclusive environment, more often than not, it can be a leadership disaster and certainly a strategic failure.
You're absolutely right. And that's, when I talk about the first reason why people want to come together and meet in person is to reconnect, is to establish that rapport, those connections, that emotional bonds, that trust building. I don't do trust building exercises, right? All the conversations we have in the meetings is doing that, sitting knee to knee, sitting around a table, talking about something that's important, builds that. Because the more that I know about you, you know about me, we're able to do business and work through key issues. And that inclusion is so important. I think this is what some people are missing in the hybrid workplace. I get it. The Washington Post wrote an article a couple weeks ago. Fridays in the office is no longer a thing, right? So how do you develop that rapport and trust when you're in a hybrid situation, you're not together all the time? And so I think being intentional about that is important. And as leaders, not just, with your other leaders, but with your staff, how are you engendering their ability to contribute and speak up? How safe is it? How inclusive are you?
And what does that do? I mean, if you're able to have leadership that creates that environment, what does it do for change management or change leadership, or however you think about the progress from A to B or from one place to another?
I think in the beginning, and when large scale change projects are done well, and I've gone through several ones recently around culture change, in particular DEI culture change issues. And when done well, where people are able to speak from their own point of view, what the realities are in the organization, what's working, what could be improved, and their own contribution to that, and then steps are made forward for the change, people can see a through line from their own contributions to what ultimately gets decided that gets changed. Right there, you've got buy-in. Additionally, by gathering more ideas, and Mike, I know you've seen this, you get better solutions. These are complex issues. These are not, yes, no answers. These are like multi-dynamic problems that people are trying to solve. So you get more innovation if you encourage more participation. And then I would say, as you're going through a change process, that feedback mechanism, that course correction I talked about, you have to get reflections from the whole system in order to shift things quicker, which, that might save your bottom line, or that might get your product to market faster, whatever the business goal is, right? I mean, don't forget, we have business reasons for why we're in organizations, but the usefulness of that whole ability to engage people in the system at different levels is so important.
So what's changed? I mean, in 2020, at the initial stages of the COVID pandemic, you launched a book, Virtual Meetings 101, a guidebook for creating successful virtual meetings. Tough time to launch a book at any time, but particularly at the beginning of a global pandemic. What? And you had to prepare to write that book, so that didn't happen overnight. What changed? What's changed from the lead up to your Virtual Meetings 101, a guidebook for creating successful virtual meetings, which launched in 2020, and today here we are in the second half of 2022.
Yeah. Well, I mean, so again, we're still dealing with the effects of the COVID pandemic. You still have an ongoing global supply chain issue. We're still reeling from the aftermath of the Great Resignation and the demands that employees are making on their employer around their time and their value. We're dealing with some pretty intense social turbulence. I'll speak in the US, but you see it also globally. And both employees and society at large are looking at companies to say, well, where do you stand? These are things that never, I mean, I have been pretty stunned by some of the news coming out of organizations after, the Supreme Court ruling about where they stood. And I thought I would never have seen a statement like that even 5 years ago. Hell, even 3 years ago, I would never have seen a statement like that from some of these companies. And yet here they are doing that.
Is it that we're learning more about respect as an important lever in inclusion, maybe as a fundamental? To me, respect is around, it's the expression of a humanistic value.
Yeah.
Trust, respect, which certainly underlies at least the brands of organization development that are familiar to me and that are based in humanism or humanistic values.
Exactly. And again, these are companies that are, they're there to make a profit, do good, to have a product, a service. And yet this idea of, as you were saying, inclusion, respect, fundamental fairness for human beings is also now part of the language that they share.
What's happening out there, Laura, in your world or from your point of view? Or what could we do more of? So what are you seeing today, or what could we do more of in terms of forwarding, in terms of generating the subtleties of our organization development practices to successive generations, particularly, given the climate that you've just described?
So there's two things that I'm constantly thinking about, no matter sort of the content of my client engagements. One is sort of a meta thing that I'm using, which is a strength-based approach to change, appreciative inquiry, using the strengths of an organization. Not that we don't talk about what's not working, but rather finding those pockets of like, we're successful here, why, and really unpacking what enabled that, what structures were in place, what were the conversations that were happening, how were people, empowered, encouraged, all of the things. What did people believe in? And seeing where can we repeat that, right? And how can we carry that forward? So using strengths to go into this future, because there are things that are happening like this new way of working. Again, 3 years ago, there was not here and there people did the I'm going to work from home today bit, but not 3 days out of 5. This is now a new way of working. And so that ability to pull from what has served us well into the future helps. And that's one thing. On the other side, but another pillar for me is this ability to think in polarities, right? I need to innovate, be entrepreneurial, and yet I got to meet quarterly returns or regulatory, standards. So it's not an either or. You got to do both. And so a lot of my conversations with leaders now is how to have them think in a very expansive way and work fast.
And what new skills, perhaps, or what behaviors do you have to reinforce in order to move away from a problem orientation to a more positive replication and generation approach?
Yeah, I think I mentioned it a little while ago. It's the ability to reframe. That's kind of a fundamental quality or ability, and that's a muscle that can be strengthened over time. I was doing a large scale change project, a DEI one, last year, and at the beginning, when I was suggesting to the staff, well, if you could reframe your experience, that might support you. And I got a lot of eye rolls. Also got them from the leaders. They're like, no, this is the way it is. But slowly but surely, as we started talking through different scenarios and different real experiences, and people were offering for each other different ways of looking at things as learning opportunities, or like, okay, that's not great. What could it be? It allowed people to both get expressed about their real experiences, but also to be able to see new ways of thinking about what can we do next, right? So it gets people out of just being angry about the past and go, okay, that happened. We don't want that to happen again. What can happen? What should happen, right? And get them into a forward momentum into thinking about the future.
For you to most effectively and most authentically intervene in a client system, and I know the move starts with a move, as I was reminded today by Francis Baldwin. I was thinking about where do you most effectively intervene? Does it have to be with a senior leader in an organization? For example, if I speak with Dr. Gina Cox, the author of Inclusion, Leading Inclusion, she takes a very top-down approach to all of her work related to inclusion. And yet, I know that in many ways, your work has been systemically to engage an entire system in various representational modes. I mean, representational settings. But where's the juice for you today? Where's the given that we have choices that we make in terms of work, where is the intervention point?
You don't get anywhere if you don't have the top leaders bought in, and not just bought in, but like enthusiastic about this is going to help the company. This is the future, right? So I spent a lot of my time working with the senior teams, getting them aligned around the change effort about this compelling future. But again, as you pointed out, my work has been about the system, the whole system. And so helping them design and develop what I call large-scale change. What are the different interventions? What are the different activities at the mid-level, full staff, external stakeholders, the communications, all of those things coming together over time to ensure the change happens the way they want it to is important. Leaders can't do it alone. They have to have everybody with them into the future. And so, but if they're not aligned, there will be, it won't go well. It'll just be like, oh, that was last year's initiative. Wonder what's going to happen next year, right? That sort of ennui sets in. So,
So given this period that we've had of sustained, I don't know what we want to call it, but sustained sense of when is it right? When is the timing right? And as you described earlier in our conversation, Laura Gramling, that people come together, it's a little bit different now. Whether that's because of who's in the room, whether that's because people haven't seen each other in some time, whether that's because of a bias to meet in preference for important work. What are the different skills that you might be bringing in these situations today?
I don't know if the skill sets are different, but I will say the tempo and the rhythm of these meetings is different. It's much more deliberate. People want to talk. Even the non-talkers, like people want to be seen and they want to be heard. They've been behind a Zoom camera for 2.5 years and they've got thoughts and opinions. And so to be able to design conversations so that they can go deep, but you have to move forward is the key. And so I found my timing of what I thought, oh, that's just a 20-minute conversation turned into a 40 or 45-minute conversation, right? Because people have a lot on their minds.
And in some teams and in some groups, as I've experienced recently, is many members are unfamiliar with each other. They're new to each other. Maybe they were just tired a week ago or 2 weeks ago. They've traveled around the globe. Not that any of that is new or different. Not that any of that's new, but it seems to have a different kind of quality that really does require a leadership commitment?
Absolutely. I mean, no time had people been hired or changed teams during a global pandemic. It's never been done before, or at least not for 100 years, right? So this way of working has really shifted, right? On some ways, like we've gotten to know each other a little bit differently because we see each other's homes and how we live, and we've heard the dog and the kids and the delivery man, all of that happening in the background of people's lives. And yet, people will meet each other and be like, wow, I didn't realize how tall you were, or right. Right. Like you don't get a sense of that kinetic experience. Human beings have been sitting in circles, as you know, Mike, since the beginning of being human beings. This is fundamental to who we are, that sharing, that connecting, that I come back to it. I mean, the neuroscientists can probably say it a lot more eloquently than I can, but that ability to build trust and collaboration happens when we're together.
Yeah, and we don't do enough of sitting in circles. I mean, we get behind these giant conference tables or boardrooms, and it's no wonder people are bored out of their skulls like 30 minutes later.
Well, Mike, I don't do any meetings like that. So even if I was set into a boardroom, I'd make people get into small groups and figure out a way. And even sometimes that's the magic, right? The fact that it got all messy, and like just pull your chairs over there and create a little group. Like, but that's needed. And
And do you experience, or do you find that in certain ways that given the amount of independence some professionals have had over the last couple of years relative to not the demands of work, but in terms of a remote work location or choosing to work in other places, do you think that's made the job of facilitation more difficult because people do have a point of view? When they get together, they do have a judgment. They don't want to do a lot of work in groups. They want to talk as a large group, or they. Do you see that in an increasing nature that people want more control over the experience?
Actually, no. Quite the opposite. I think, first of all, people are burnt out. I have yet to have a client who hasn't talked to me about burnout, this year. Right. So these opportunities, when you come together, even though, they're going to go through a series of conversations and it's a lot of, it's a different way of thinking than they normally would be at their home, or their office. Right. It's generative. It's, having to pull a lot of data. It's having to have your enterprise hat. Like it's these types of corporate meetings where you do strategy work is very different than your typical what you do on a daily basis. So it expands the mind. And I think it allows people, when done well, it gives them this opportunity to see things from like, oh, that's what manufacturing is dealing with. No wonder, right? So it should also help with how work gets done. Instead of being so isolated, you get to understand, well, why is Mike saying that? Now I see. Why does Laura talk about that all the time? Now I get it, right? So I think people are, by and large, my clients, when I have to work through the detailed agendas, are like, mostly like, if you think that'll work, great. And then when I'm in it, people are just very much like, okay, what's the next conversation? What's the next conversation? Maybe we're sort of in a honeymoon period. I'm not sure, but again, they just want to connect. They want to talk.
And it's figuring out or helping the group to figure out what are the important and the right conversations to have, and to have the leadership support in order to do that. And it's one way, given your expertise in facilitation, clients vary on their level of control and the ability to exercise, I wouldn't call it influence on the agenda, because hopefully everyone's influential in a meeting, and we create the kinds of environments for that where people feel heard. but to think about the control of the executive and what she or they are willing to claim and what they're willing to relinquish.
That's true. And, one of the things is I'm never going to know their business as well as they do. I'm never going to know, for them, they're usually planning ahead. So these conversations need to be in service of, all right, how's it been? What's working? What's not? What do we need to do better? And can we get aligned? Right. So these meetings, you've been through them. They're very focused. And so as I'm collaborating with my client, and I also don't know the culture as well as they do, right? So I'm offering them ways of kind of expansion, opening up the aperture, getting innovative, getting creative in the moment. And certain types of conversations or exercises are going to land and some are not. And when my client says no or they push back, I find that to be useful in a generative way, because usually what ends up happening is the right agenda, the right conversation. I'm very smart. I'll do a lot of research and homework and data gathering. But until I talk with the client about what's going to make the difference here, we don't land on that final solution except together.
And I wonder about the work of higher purpose today. I think about a lot of the communication work I did in some big organizations, a long time ago, was focused on, even though we may not agree on the facts of a particular situation or see the situation in the same way, we could focus on a higher purpose. And, often in for-profit organizations, it's a focus on the external paying customer. If we can't agree on anything else, we can agree that, somebody's footing the bill at the end of the day. And I'm sure that is also depending on the sector that you're with which you're involved. And given how hardened some views seem today, how do you begin to create that, particularly in some of the enterprises with that you and Enspark Consulting work with, that are really based on social transformation and justice and equity work? And how do you begin to bring all of that to a new rationality so that we can claim both our rational sides and our effective sides?
Without seeming vague, it's about having just the right enough structure to support the ongoing work.
No, that makes sense.
Some of these large social change, it's going to take time, but yet the next structure that's built, the next policy, the next procedure, the next, goes a long way towards that ultimate, final outcome that people want,
Yeah. It's really Chandler's theorem all over again. Strategy, structure, behavior. I mean, there's a certain consistency to this if you want it to work well.
It is. I mean, I'm going to misquote him, but, Martin Luther King talked about the arc of justice is long, but it will bend, but it takes people doing things over time. And it takes people doing things collaboratively over time. That's the other thing that I feel like over the last pandemic, even though people have felt isolated, it has taken communities to support getting work done in their organizations, in society, dealing with this pandemic. So we are social beings, and that has really come to the forefront. So I get back to that, as a good leader, you have to connect, you have to create rapport, you have to create trust.
As people connect with you as the leader of Enspark Consulting, are you talking organization development? Are you talking large group meetings? Are you talking inclusion initiatives? Or how does it, how does the work come to find you?
Yeah. Typically, it's like, I need to have a meeting. and then we go from there. But what I undercover very quickly is what is this meeting in service of? And it could be at the beginning of a large change effort, right? It could be, this is our third time around the wheel around trying to course correct a strategy. It could be any number of things, but understanding where this meeting sits in a past and a future really supports us in being able to design and develop not only a great experience and outcomes, but then there might be opportunities to do some of that more large scale change work.
And I assume, I'm not sure, I'd like to check this out. You operate from a system or a belief that can be done from any seat. And are there particular barriers that you're seeing to expression, that people are afraid of different versions of the truth, or that there aren't psychologically safe environments in order to contribute? Are you having to do things differently today than perhaps a couple of years ago?
I think there is more of a willingness now from top leaders to hear from staff at all levels about what's going on. Certainly when I do feedback sessions and when I go out and gather data, both quantitative and qualitative from staff, I'm doing it anonymously. And yet, when I'm theming things back and presenting it to the leaders, I'm not pulling any punches. I'm trying to paint an as-is situation so they really understand, again, the things that are working that we can improve upon, and what the aspirations or the hopes are. Like, what's that gap that's there? A lot of people, over this past year with the Great Resignation, were wondering, well, how do we keep these the talent? And sometimes it had to do a lot with the culture of a place, the burnout that I referenced earlier. What can you do about that? Yeah.
And I think that some of our, greatest work, I've moved away from talking about cultures to thinking about communities and the power of community and what happens in the group of three. All work that I know has been familiar to you and certainly has been at the forefront of some of the organizational change and social change initiatives that you've been lucky to be a part of. Laura, I know there are there's lots of interest among our audience about Enspark Consulting, and just everyone will see it in the show notes, but just in case, that's Enspark, Enspark. What's the origin story there, Laura?
Yeah, this goes back several years, but for me, when a good focus of my work is on the meeting, right? But that should spark. There should be a catalyst. That should light the way forward. And so I was playing with words and imagery, and so I came up with Enspark, and I like it still to this day, as my work is growing as well. And that's the other thing. I've had to go through a change and a pivot for myself. At the beginning of the year, I thought, well, maybe I'm going to go, internal, go work for a firm, I really wanted to build an OD team. And I'm very inspired to do that. And I'd always thought of myself as a solo practitioner. But that's not what my clients were asking for. And that's not what the universe was asking me to do. And so here, in August now of 2022, I am finding I'm building a firm, and I'm delighted at it. I'm delighted bringing in junior consultants and having them learn how to be great consultants and facilitators, being able to bring on a bunch of senior facilitators and consultants who have different skill sets in the realm of coaching and leadership development and all kinds of data analysis, and being able to pull together the right team to support a client, whether it's a meeting or for a longer change initiative. So I'm finding I'm having to learn and apply all the things I tell leaders about how to do things. So it's been a great year for that.
Oh, that's great. And I'm sure that one of the easiest ways that our audience can get in touch with Laura Gramling, president of Enspark Consulting, is right through that website, ENSPARK consulting.com, ensparkconsulting.com. You'll also be able to find Laura at a couple places in social media, and you'll see all of this in the show notes. But you can find Laura on LinkedIn, Laura Gramling, on Instagram at the DC Facilitation Guru. Who would have thought? I mean, that's such a great identity that you've had over the years, the DC Facilitation Guru. And then on Twitter at Enspark C. But all of that in the show notes to everyone in the audience. But particularly for those of you who I think are interested in mentorship, in terms of change, in terms of thinking about where we're headed in terms of creating great acceleration for effective change, Laura Gramling and Enspark Consulting would be a wonderful resource.
Thank
Laura,
you so
any
much.
last words? Yes.
Yeah, no, thank you. I just I encourage people to meet, to get together, to do this sitting in circles and thinking. That time is well spent.
And from no better source than than an expert on meetings and facilitation and bringing people together to achieve strategic intent, strategic goals, and to make progress. It's been a delight to have in our virtual studio today, Laura Gramling. Thank you so much, Laura. And to all of our listeners, until the next episode of the Authentic Change Podcast, stay well.
Thank you for listening to the Authentic Change Podcast. I'm delighted that you've tuned in to listen. Please visit the show notes for links to topics discussed in today's podcast. To download a free ebook on authentic change and leadership and to subscribe to my newsletter, please visit mike-horn.com. Once again, mike-horne.com, mike-horn.com. Once again, thank you for listening to the Authentic Change Podcast.